Okay, we're back again. And so we were just talking about reasons for and against evaluation. We also have to see that, evaluation helps us to see if our strategy is working out the way we wanted it to. So this is again why I put this segment here, because it's about setting objectives and meeting them. So objectives are the, fundamental part of strategy. And if we set them correctly, and if our advertising execution or our marketing communications program meets them, then we can determine that, with the evaluation. Of course, there's that saying, you can't manage what you don't measure. We also can evaluate the overall integration. Is there consistency between the various media or marketing communications tools? Is a message consistent? We can evaluate the timing. Did the public relations and publicity program coincide with the advertising and, our event marketing programs or our online campaigns? And the target markets, do we have the right target markets between these different platforms? So it's not easy to measure the effectiveness of our marketing communications program. It's expensive, but in the end, the reason that larger companies will use research and evaluation is because the value outweighs the drawbacks. Another way of using evaluation, or evaluating the marketing communications program, is to decide between different alternatives, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. That there's different ways of using this evaluation. One of them is to figure out if we have alternative approaches, like, the creative team comes up with 3 or 4 different approaches and we're not sure which one is the best. We can test that and see which one of these alternatives to use on a larger scale. So in advertising testing, we have a few questions to ask. One is when to test, and this leads to a discussion of, the 2 alternative categories of research: strategic research and evaluative research. Strategic research tries to determine what's the correct strategy to use, what's the best approach to use for, what's the best message strategy to develop. Evaluative research tests the outputs of the advertising, the either semi-finished or almost finished executions, or even the finished executions, to see if those advertisements actually perform well or perform as intended. So strategic research is before we make the advertisements. Evaluative research evaluates their effectiveness afterward. So we have pre-tests, where we pre-test the advertisements to see if they're working, or they will be, will they work as they're intended. We can pre-test even just concepts. Before we even make a finished advertisement, we can just test various concepts, like advertising ideas. We can test rough copies. We can, make mock-ups of advertisements, or even, the music, or whatever we want to test. We can test finished ads, and we can also have post-tests. Oh, by the way, pre-tests just reminded me that it's not just pre-testing concepts, but also when we test the it's kind of like benchmarking, if you will. We can benchmark with pretests, like benchmark the level of awareness, of knowledge about the brand, etc. Various, slogan awareness, or understanding of the position, the brand's position or brand associations. And we can have pre-tests before the campaign and post-tests after the campaign. So what do we test? Well, we can test the message and the execution. We can test, for example, various message alternatives or various message strategies. We can test the advertisements themselves in market, or even before we bring them to market. I'll discuss a few different approaches to that. We can test the sources. We can, if we were thinking about 3 or 4 different possible famous, celebrities, which one works the best with our audience, we can test that. We can also test the channel, which media vehicles, like which magazines or which television programs work best. We can also test the media weights. The weight means, basically the budget. How many times is the ad shown in a given month. We can test which is more effective, having heavier or lighter. Basically keeping in mind that it costs more to show it more, so we want that the minimum level of effectiveness. Without sacrificing effectiveness, we don't want to overspend. And where to test? Well, we can test in a laboratory, and there's a few different approaches which we'll talk about. And we can also do field tests, like put the advertisements in the field and see how well they work. Actually show them on television, or put them in the magazines, in real magazines, and then see, or do ad campaigns like Google AdWords, and test different different alternative AdWord campaigns, and see which ones work best. And there's a trend towards using the internet now, to get participants to use for our testing. We can either use an agency, and they usually have online panels that they can reach through the internet, or we might be able to find our own approach, using our own means to develop a sample using the internet. How to test? Well, there's many different ways. There's many different methods. Usually we need to use an agency, an expert, research agency, but not always. There's approaches that we can do in-house. Even if it's not very sophisticated, we can, even just showing different ads to our friends that are, that we trust their judgment, or they're in the market, the target market. We're trying to develop a sample of our friends and family to just figure out if this advertisement is perceived as we want it to be perceived. Obviously, if it's a big company, they're going to use an agency and they're going to spend money on it, but a lot of times smaller businesses don't have that budget, but they still should try to, as much as possible, test out various methods, various advertisements, sorry. And we should follow the principles of good advertising research. Your textbook gives this, don't look at the page. Depending upon which edition of the book you have, it might be on a different page, but it's this packed principles for advertising copy testing. It's positioning, advertising, copy testing. That's what the PACT stands for. These are just the principles of good, what you should do when you're testing advertising, like the basic principles. I'll leave these online. You can go through. I don't want to spend time going through each one, but just basically, demonstrate reliability and validity is the bottom line. Like number 9, reliability and validity is the bottom line. It has to be reliable and valid. All the other things add up to that reliability and validity. If you're using an agency, they should know how to do this stuff. Okay, so let's just look at some typical measures. First, one measure is, after you've seen the advertisement, testing how congruent the message and the brand are, the congruence with the brand and the intended message. Do people see the brand and does the message kind of reinforce that brand? Does it fit? Does it match with the brand? How likable is the ad, and how persuaded the audience is? And you do this with pre-tests and post-tests. Persuasion is attitude change or behavior change. So, do they feel or think differently pre-test versus post-test? Do they increase their purchase intention or their frequency of purchase? There's also what are known as brand switch measures. How likely are they to, after seeing the ad, you first measure their brand preference before the ad, and then afterwards, how likely are they to switch after seeing that advertisement? How likely are they to switch to your brand? And then again, pre and post test purchase related beliefs. Like, do they believe that this brand will perform this particular function or has this level of quality, or are they willing to pay this level of price for this, again, before the ad and after the ad? And their emotional responses, which emotions are aroused or evoked when they watch the ad, and the intensity of these emotions. And another very standard ad measurement, this is pretty much one that's measured in every research program, is recall, or what they, normally it's day after recall. So the day following, you put your advertisement on television, and then the next day the research agencies will call up the sample and they'll ask, did you see this? Do you remember seeing any commercials on television last night? Advertisements on television. Can you tell me what they were? Did you remember seeing any ads for soap? Bath soap. Okay. Do you remember seeing any ads, and which ads did you see? And, do you remember seeing any Haji Shakir ads? So, well, the reason you're probably wondering why there's a man in a gorilla suit. Well, David Ogilvy, the kind of, patron saint of advertising, he's like the god of advertising, David Ogilvy. You can read about him, and he's got a book, David Ogilvy. But he said, like, the problem with recall measures, recall is extremely important. It is important, if people don't remember your ad, then basically it was invisible, right? That's the first most important thing, is the ad has to get attention. People have to remember it. But the problem is that, recall isn't everything. Although it's important, it doesn't mean that your ad, is successful just if it's highly recalled. Because as David Ogilvy said, if I put a man in a gorilla suit and, my advertisement shows a guy in a gorilla suit, the next day people will remember, yes, I saw that advertisement with the guy in the gorilla suit, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to run out and buy your product or your brand, or you're not going to maybe achieve the specific objectives you set. So recall is important, but it's not everything. Okay, so we have various pre-testing methods, but I think because time is running out, it's about 14 minutes and 20 seconds now. I will begin this in the next segment. Okay, we'll see you in a bit.